the DBD Chronicle. I'm not sure what that stands for, but I'm hoping it's not pejorative. Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make an old-fashioned, but also how to build a bar around making an old-fashioned if that is the one drink that you really enjoy. The first step is going to be the initial recipe. The second step is dialing the cocktail in and making small adjustments with the ingredients that you already have. So step 3 is then iterating, finding things that are already similar to the ingredients that you have, and kind of beginning to build a collection of stuff from your bar, but it's still to make that one drink. Step 4 is when you buy 1 or 2 extra things to begin learning other drinks. And then at the end of this video, there's going to be basically extra credit. The original recipe that we're going to be using for this first step, this is 3 quarts blended bourbon. Comes in just over 40%, so a little bit over 80 proof. Kind of light actually as far as the heat or the alcohol content on a bourbon is concerned. It's also a blended bourbon, which means it's going to be consistent, it should be smooth, it should be sort of even keel, meaning not too sweet, not too spicy, and not too bland. Your second thing that you're going to need is going to be your sweetener. And we're going to be using a simple syrup. This is actually a simple syrup that I made here at the bar. Unfortunately, I don't have any granulated sugar, so I can't show you how to make any from scratch. And then your third ingredient is going to be your bitters. So any kind of aromatic bitters, but the industry standard is going to be Angostura aromatic bitters. The bottle will always look like this. It will always have the overgrown paper, the yellow cap, and so on and so forth. 2 ounces of your bourbon, 1/4 ounce of your syrup, or a bar spoon of granulated sugar if you don't have simple syrup, and then about 3 dashes of Angostura bitters. That's where we're going to start. Key point here, all of the ingredients for all cocktails only have about 5 different roles that they can be filling. Liquor, lengthener, sweetener, sour, and spice. Let's get started putting this together. For glassware, you're going to want a rocks glass. These are sometimes referred to as old-fashioned glasses. I recommend that you have is going to be a stirring glass of some kind. If you don't have a stirring glass, that's okay. Don't put your ice in your glass first. You're going to want to measure all of your liquid ingredients separate from your ice, and then add your ice on top, hopefully before it's melted too much. And then you're going to stir it up. Grab your measuring utensil, whatever you have. I have this little jigger right here. This is 2 ounces on the top and then 1 ounce on the bottom. So that's 60 mils on the top, 30 mils on the bottom if you're following along in metric. So that original recipe, 2 ounces of your bourbon on top, 1/4 ounce of your simple syrup. If the only sweetener that you have is granulated sugar or even stevia, just do a little bar spoon of that. Drop that in there. You will have to muddle it though. 3 dashes of your bitters. Add your ice. And now you have a chilled glass. Quick note on stirring technique. Don't dwell on this too much because you don't need to get this perfect. But notice how my elbow isn't moving, my wrist isn't moving, everything kind of just happens in my fingers. And whenever I'm using my stirring glass here, I like using a julep strainer instead, or straining spoon, whatever you call it at home. Put that here on top, and we're just gonna, it's my favorite part every time. Actually, it looks like a significant amount of cocktail. Yeah, doesn't that look good? Look at that consistency. Look at how it's all one color. It's not misty, it's not cloudy, which is another thing that'll happen if you agitate it too much in stirring it, or if you shake it, which again, I recommend that you don't do. Add the ice. You shouldn't need to stir it around any more than this. Some people, by the way, will also just build their old fashions in the glass itself. That's fine. I mean, do you? Taste test. It makes me want to like curl up in front of a fire. This is section 2. We're going to call this section dialing it in or making adjustments. So dilution is going to be one of the most important things that is really hard to dial in and get right and consistent. So it's going to be a factor in pretty much everything that could be wrong. So that's going to be one of the first things that you want to get down pat. Your ideal dilution is going to be about 20% of your final volume, which is why, even though I did 2 ounces of this, a 1/4 ounce of my syrup, and then a few dashes of bitters, I ended up with a bunch of liquid. The first thing, and this is probably the most common one, is your drink is too strong. Believe it or not, that is a thing. Some people think that that's a myth. It's definitely real. It can happen. My recommendation is to add dilution if you feel like there's too much heat, for a lot of reasons. One, I don't want you to have to start over from scratch. But also two, it's relatively easy to just add ice. Adding ice is one of the best ways to add dilution. And when you're talking about an old fashioned, it's already going to dilute itself. So if it's not perfect immediately and you think that it may have too much heat or too much alcohol content, give it a second to mellow out, let some of the ice melt, wiggle it around, try it again. It's not going to take long. It may be like 10 to 20 seconds, and you should know if this is the issue. The other obvious answer is going to be, use a different bottle, right? Typically, we're going to be using bourbon. Bourbon is derived mostly from corn, so it's a little bit sweeter. The other obvious alternatives are going to be rye, which is going to be a little bit more spicy. It's going to have more heat, more of that bite that I mentioned before. You also have wheated bourbon or wheat whiskey that's going to just kind of be even keel, think like white bread. The second most common thing is that your drink is too sweet, which is actually what's happened here. A couple of other ways that people describe sweet drinks is instead of calling them sweet, for whatever reason, they'll use words like sticky or syrupy. What do you do if your drink is too sticky, too syrupy, too sweet? A couple of really obvious things that you can do here is you can add dilution, plop some more ice in there, give it 10 to 20 seconds, and see if it opens up a little bit. The second thing that you could do, and I don't typically make this recommendation, is start over and use less syrup. That's going to be easier to dial in. Masking the sweetness in an old fashioned is going to be relatively difficult because, like I mentioned before, it doesn't have that acidic sour component to sort of eat up that sugar. And then the third thing, you guys probably guessed this was coming already, but the third thing is that your drink is too bitter. So I'm going to preface this. Nobody says that. Nobody says that their old fashioned is too bitter. They'll use words like floral, fruity, pungent, herbaceous or herbal, or spiced, which is different from spicy. Functionally, what is happening is that the aromatics, the smells of the bitters that you had in there, are masking the flavors of everything else. Rather than accenting them, you would either add sweetener. A little bit more sweetener will help curb the bitterness of the drink. Redo it and use fewer bitters. Adding dilution will help a lot. And one quick cheat code that no one will tell you, especially not when you're starting out, is you can add a pinch of salt. Salt actually inhibits your body's ability to perceive bitterness in food. Remember, my recommendation was actually to use less syrup. So all the rest of my measurements are going to stay the same. 2 ounces of my bourbon, 3 dashes of my bitters. Now, instead of doing a 1/4 ounce, because I need to do a little bit less than that, I'm actually just going to do a bar spoon here. Cool. And then really quick, my syrup is really sticky, so I'm going to try and just wash some of that off. Add your ice in. Stir away. We're not going to do a super long pour. Just going to do a nice, tasteful one here. See how it tastes. Yeah, the first one was good. This one is great. Still not perfect though. You're not gonna get it exactly right the second time. This one, I'm almost getting too much of those bitters. I'll sip on that while I tell you guys about phase 3. So phase 3 is your first experimental phase, really, where you begin to branch out of these original 3 ingredients. Though it's not hyper experimental, right? You're not going to go out and get you're not going to go out and try this with tequila or something like that. For your liquor, staying in the family of whiskey and hopefully staying in the family of American whiskey, you have your rye here on my left. The green label is always going to be your rye whiskey. What that means is that this is made predominantly out of rye grain rather than corn, which is what bourbon is made out of. And then, whereas we started with a blended bourbon over here, this is a bourbon that is a small batch finished in Pinot Noir barrels. The rye here has some notes of like maple syrup, and then the bourbon here has notes of like corn flakes and brown sugar. The second thing that you can really begin making variations on is finding different kinds of sweeteners. We have simple syrup here, and I mentioned granulated sugar before. You could, if you're going to be really crazy, you could use confectioner's sugar. I don't recommend you do that. You might have some maple syrup that you don't use for your pancakes anymore. You might have some agave syrup. You might have molasses at home, and you might have honey. A good way to think about this is if you drink coffee or tea, what kind of sweetener do you prefer? If your answer is stevia or Splenda, that's fine. That's a perfectly legitimate answer. Most people will not probably want to drink your old fashioned, but if you're making them for yourself, go for it. Third thing that you're going to substitute out, or that you can substitute out, it's going to be your bitters. So hopefully you've started with aromatic bitters, and hopefully you found Angostura aromatic bitters because that's the industry standard. There are some other standards that are going to be pretty common. You can find Reagan's orange bitters and Peychaud's Orleans bitters. Same process here. I'm going to start with 2 ounces. We're using the rye, which I mentioned before. I should expect this to have a more pronounced bite, a more significant amount of heat to it. So it's going to also have a higher perceived amount of alcohol because this, I believe, is 91 proof. It doesn't sound like a huge difference, but it does make a world of a difference in your final product. So, 1/4 ounce of your maple syrup. Be careful if you're working with something that's really viscous. Make sure you get as much of it out of this as possible. I'm working with 3 different kinds of bitters. So this makes it hard to kind of dial in one of them specifically. I'm going to do 1 dash of each of these 3. And that'll tell me if I'm not picking up enough orange scent or enough orange flavor, that means that I probably need to add more orange bitters. If there isn't enough aroma or enough scent coming off of this, that probably means I need to add more Angostura aromatic bitters to lift those flavors up and make them at least perceptible to my palate. So we're going to start with 1 of each of these. Stir it up, it's in a cup, drinking rainbow. Some people will tell you that you need to stir it for, X amount of time or do 30 stirs. 20% of your final volume should be water. The other thing that's important here is bringing it down to temperature. Stirring it too quickly and for not as long will chill it very quickly, but it won't be diluted enough. Stirring it for longer will dilute it a lot, but also it'll take longer to bring down to temperature. So you kind of need to hit that sweet spot. Add some ice, and we're going to try this out. Cheers. It's too sweet again. There's actually a really judicious amount of orange in here. It almost tastes like I had expressed an orange peel over the top, which I kind of like. The last official step is, well, where do you go from here? What other kinds of drinks are near an old-fashioned that I can learn that aren't an old-fashioned style drink? There's a lot of them. So if you have sweet vermouth, then you can make a Manhattan. A Manhattan is literally going to be your whiskey, sweet vermouth, and bitters. So your sweet vermouth kind of comes in place of your simple syrup. It's not a 1-to-1. The most traditional recipe for that would be 2 parts of your whiskey, 1 part your sweet vermouth, and then 2 dashes of aromatic bitters. If you have mint syrup, you can now make a mint julep, which is literally bourbon and mint syrup in a cup. Like, that's pretty much it. There's crushed ice, and you have to have like this mint bouquet garnish and stuff like that, and it has to be served in a julep glass, theoretically. But if you have that ingredient, at least you can get in the neighborhood of making a julep. The old-fashioned doesn't inherently have anything that fills that sour category. So if you want to explore that, you want to get some citrus to see what happens, I recommend that you get lemons, and you can also get eggs, but eggs are optional here. If you do that, then you have everything that you need to make a whiskey sour. If this is the only glassware that you already have the appropriate glassware. What else can you do to really enhance the stuff that you're making? This is where we get into elevated techniques. This is why I call it extra credit. You don't need to know how to do this stuff, but it will impress people. And it will help your drinks stand apart. The first, most obvious thing that I was ignoring and avoiding this entire time is going to be garnishes. Garnishes are the first, easiest thing that you can teach yourself at home to really kind of enhance, at least visually, what you're working with. The traditional garnish, by the way, for an old fashioned is going to be an orange peel and a cherry. Some places in the world will also use lemon peels, which is permissible, but I don't recommend that that's how you teach yourself how to make the drink the first time. Make it as simple as possible with as few ingredients, and then you can add those things later on. Different kinds of infusions and different kinds of infusing processes. There are a lot of them. Most commonly, I think, is probably extraction under heat, and these don't only apply to your liquor. You can use all of these techniques to do infusions for your syrups. You can use these same kinds of techniques to make your own kinds of bitters at home too. So infusion under heat is kind of like making your own tea or making your own coffee. Be careful when you do this. Extraction, which is the process where you're pulling those flavors, those compounds, the esters and phenols and all of that stuff. Those are the desirable things that you want. That happens at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in centigrade. I apologize. And you kind of want to keep it under 5 minutes. I aim for about 4 minutes if it's at 180 degrees. If you over extract, as you begin cooking those ingredients that you're extracting, and that ends in the bleeding and leaching of tannic or bitter compounds. It's why if you've ever left your tea steeping for too long, it tends to be kind of astringent and bitter and dry by the end of it. It also shouldn't be boiling. The other thing that you can do is you can do room temperature steeping, or what I call dry infusion, where you just take the thing that you want, the flavor that you want, and you take the liquid that you want, and you just put one of those things inside of the other, and you leave it alone. This is kind of how cold brew coffee is made. It takes longer, but it's nearly impossible to cook your ingredients and accidentally extract those flavors that you don't want. If you're working with like fruit, especially whole fruit, you're probably going to be better off doing one of these kinds of cold infusion techniques. Freeze the fruit, and then when you're ready for the infusion, you take all of the frozen fruit and you can put it in some kind of like porous bag or something, and you let it sit and steep in your liquid. And as the fruit thaws, it will break the cell walls inside of the fruit itself, leaching all of those juices, unprocessed and unfettered with, directly into what you're trying to infuse. And then you just strain out all of the pulp, and you're left with this very concentrated, rich sort of infusion. So that's typically what I would go for. There's another kind of technique, in addition to infusions, called clarification. And this is even higher level than infusions. Clarification is the process by which you take something that is otherwise opaque or cloudy, and you do something to it to make it as clear as possible. The most accessible version of clarification, in my opinion, is going to be milk washing, where it sounds weird, but you add, and we've done this on a live stream, you add milk to your drink, or one of your ingredients, and it will curdle, or it should curdle. You want it to. And then you filter off the curdles off of the top so that you're left with just the clear liquid at the bottom. Essentially what happens is, as the milk curdles, it brings the rest of the solids that are suspended in solution. The solution becomes more clear because the turbidity goes down. There are fewer solids suspended in solution. And then the last one is not really going to help with clarifying, but you can charcoal filter. You can run your drink or one of your ingredients through a Brita filter, especially if it's like vodka, because the myth is that it improves the quality, it gives it a smoother taste. The simplest thing that you can do that ironically will make your job easier and impress more people is buy a barrel. Get a barrel and just fill it full of a pre-made cocktail. And that affords you a lot of other really cool opportunities too. Each of these are, I think, 1 liter, and they cost me $20 to $30 each. They're really cool. One of them even has my logo on it with like Cointricktwitch like branded on it and everything. If you're gonna make a lot of this stuff, I would recommend actually a 3-liter barrel, which is what we used at my bar to age our old fashioned, which was super popular. It'll last you a decent amount of time. I actually made a batched cocktail that I put in here in one of these over a year ago, and it's still in there. I need to add water to it because so much of the water content has leached into the oak pores. You get to kind of go crazy with whatever you're doing. Remember originally when I said, if you're making your own kind of cocktail, or you're doing one of these iterations and you're adding ingredients, try and keep your number under 6. If you're going to batch this cocktail and make that much of it, you can kind of go crazy. You can throw that number out the window. You can do all kinds of stuff. It's going to be very hard for any one of those ingredients to kind of just overwhelm everything else, because there's just going to be so much volume. In conclusion, step 1 is find a recipe for a drink that you like, get those ingredients, make that recipe. And then step 2, modify that original recipe with those same ingredients so that it's not too sweet, not too bitter, not too strong, or not too little of any of those things either. The third step is experiment. Branch out from those original 3 ingredients, start building up those extra bottles that you want. Stay in the same neighborhood of everything, right? If you've started with a whiskey cocktail, don't start going out and like buying tequila and experimenting with a tequila old fashioned. And then the last thing is getting the extra bottles to make different cocktails. And then all that extra credit stuff is start using elevated techniques, or at least start familiarizing yourself with elevated techniques so that you can talk about them. Even if you don't do that stuff at home, you can at least talk about doing infusions. And all of that stuff will also help your drinks stand out. It will help your presentation and everything as well. Thanks for sticking around, and thank you for all of your help and support, guys. Hopefully I've been helpful and supportive for you all as well, since that's the whole reason we do all of this stuff. If you learned something, don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment what drinks you want to learn to make at home, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video.